This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzanotes, and today is Saturday. That means it's time for Nizzanotes, my weekly vlog series about limited magic. Today I'll be talking about Lord of the Rings, Tales of Middle-earth Limited, and in particular, I'm going to talk about 10 things I was wrong about in the set, both from my set review and in last week's 5 early takeaway videos. I think there are 2 things from that video that I got wrong now that I've played the format more. So let's dive right in. First, we'll talk about those 2 things from the 5 early takeaways video. So first of all, one of my early takeaways was that the Simic Scry deck was the best deck in the format. This has proved to be almost entirely wrong, and not almost entirely wrong, it is entirely wrong and not even close to true as we have more and more data about this limited format. You know, that's the thing, you know, with early takeaway videos, I'm usually only a handful of drafts in. I'm relying entirely on anecdotal evidence, and sometimes you're just going to be wrong, you know, and that's what happened. Because overall, I mean, according to the data, on 17 Lands, you know, a site that I talk about a lot here in this series that, you know, records a bunch of Magic Arena Limited data. You can check them out at 17lands.com. Simic is the worst of the 10 color pairs. So, you know, the exact opposite. I do think it's going to correct some. You know, right now I think it has like a 49% win percentage, which is absolutely abysmal. It'll probably correct some, you know. I think if you end up with the right payoffs, it can still be a pretty good deck. But overall, it actually, like on average in your typical draft, you're probably going to be better off avoiding Simic. So you need to open the right payoffs or the deck's just not going to come together. So that is one thing that I think I was very wrong about. There was another thing I said in the video. You know, I thought the Ring Tempts You is just okay. And I don't think I'm nearly as wildly wrong about this one, but I think that is still sort of underselling the Ring Tempts You mechanic, which is fairly central to the format, as it turns out. You know, I still kind of hate that the third ability is pretty much useless, and that does make it worse than it would be if it actually did something. But the other 3 are good. I mean, especially once you get to Chapter 2, you get a pretty big upgrade, and then once you get to Chapter 4, I keep saying chapter about this, but you know what I mean, the 4th level, the 4th ability on the emblem. Once you get there, like, it's pretty good. You can close out games with it. You know, making sure you have creatures that are good for the Ring Tempts You, like usually low power, high toughness creatures. These sorts of things have, you know, been things you really have to think about in the format. And so overall, it is pretty good. So yeah, the Ring Tempts You is way more important in the format than I initially thought in my early takeaway video. And I gave you really bad advice when I said Simic is the best deck in the format. It's not. And I think it may shake out, you know, even once we have a larger sample size of data, it may end up being the worst color pair in the format. We'll just have to see. All right, so those are a couple of takeaways I was wrong about. Let's talk now about 8 individual cards that I think I got wrong in the set review. First, there's Quarrel's End. This is the 2 generic in a red. You discard a card as an additional cost to cast this. Draw 2, make a 1/1. You know, we see cards like this all the time. They're usually like the 23rd card in your deck that sort of makes the cut, but you're usually not very happy to have it. So I wasn't really very high on this card. I mean, I noted in the set review, I was like, you know, it does add to the board. The other ones don't do that, but it also costs a whole extra mana, and I'm not sure about that. You know, so I thought it would be, you know, usually fill that slot. But it turns out adding to the board while you do this effect, I mean, it's just a huge difference. You know, first of all, the token, there's lots of things you can do with this token in the format. Even just making it a ring bearer can be, you know, fine. You can sacrifice it. There's a few human payoffs. Like, there's stuff going on here that makes this token, you know, play better than it looks. But just in general, even if it wasn't a token that had some synergy in the format, I think this card was just always going to be better than I thought. I mean, once you think about it as a 3-mana 1/1 that lets you discard a card and draw 2 cards, that's pretty good. I mean, it's not quite that, because if your opponent counters it, you still have to discard the card. There's some problems with that being how I describe it, but you get what I mean. Like, it does a pretty good job of digging you deep in your library. You know, it works well in the spell deck. It works well in pretty much all the red decks in the format, and that's one thing that helps make it better too, is that it's kind of a glue card that's good in all the red decks for one reason or another. And so I basically always want one of these in my red decks in the format. So that is certainly not the kind of card that's like your 23rd playable, the last card that makes your deck. It's a card that's certainly, higher up than that, somewhere in the middle, and usually not. The first copy should basically never be cut. Next up, I've got Nazgul. I was pretty high on this going into the format. I mean, how couldn't you be? It's at worst a 3-mana 2/3 Death Touch that gives you a ring tempt trigger. That was something I was already pretty happy about. And if you got enough ring tempting stuff going on, it would grow even more. So I gave it a good grade. I gave it a grade where you can first pick it sometimes, but it's even better than that. Mostly, I mean, part of it is black is pretty much the best color in the format, and part of that is they have all these really high quality commons, and a bunch of them are just like cards that would already be fine, and then they have a ring tempts you trigger attached to them. And so if you're in any black deck in this format, you're gonna have like, without even trying, because you're just taking like removal that says the ring tempts you, you're taking, all kinds of things that just say the ring tempts you that you'd be playing anyway, you end up having a pretty critical mass of that. And so Nazgul ends up growing even more than I ever expected. And in the end, like, most of the rares and mythics in the format are worse than Nazgul. That's how good it is. Like you more often than not would be correct to first pick Nazgul if you open it in a booster pack, even though it's an uncommon and so forth. It's just that good. And it gets really absurd when you have multiples, because they just feed off of each other. They both keep growing. So part of it is the ring tempts you is even better than I thought. Part of it is that just all the black commons that say the ring tempts you on it are pretty good. Like, it's true of most cards that say the ring tempts you, or at least a majority, that they're all playable, but in black there's not one that isn't, like they're all just really good, and that really helps elevate how good the Nazgul can be. Next, I've got Fear Fire Foes. I liked this a reasonable amount going into the format. I had some reservations about it, but I, recognized it had, it has real 2-for-1 potential. The thing that I don't like about it, and that's true, I mean, saying I don't like it about it is an exaggeration, because, this is a card going into this review I thought you should never cut, and you could take pretty highly. But the thing the one thing that I don't like about any of these X spells that have 1 red as an additional cost, that was a weird way of saying that, but you know what I mean. It costs X and a red. So what generally ends up happening is you spend more mana than your opponent did to kill something. It's just never going to feel that efficient. But, part of the reason I did like it more than most versions of this kind of effect is because, I could see it easily picking off an X1 as well, and that obviously makes it way better. But it ends up killing multiple X1s way more often than I ever expected. There's a lot of them in this format, and they're often ring bearers, and you can kill them while killing like their best creature. You also pick off 2 1/1 tokens or something. Like, it ends up being a huge swingy play, and it's really in the same neighborhood as Nazgul in terms of the quality of a card it is. This format has a lot of good uncommons. These are maybe, they're in the conversation for 2 of the best, certainly. And Fear Fire Foes, like, it just ends up having an even bigger impact on the board than I ever expected. And so, like Nazgul, like, more often than not, like, if you open Fear Fire Foes, you could take it and you'd be right like 90% of the time. Next, there's Horses of the Bruinen. This is one I got really wrong. So we've seen a lot of these effects over the years, and I never really liked them in the past. They, 5 mana, bounce 2 things, the ring tempts you. You'd never end up getting a card back from this type of effect, or at least you usually don't, because, and all you're really generating is tempo, right? You're bouncing a couple of things, and then your opponent can just recast them, but you went down a card. And in most limited formats, most of the time, card advantage is more powerful than tempo, because games tend to go longer overall. So, that's why I talk about 2-for-1s all the time. Things like that are massive in limited. But this particular version of the effect is cheaper than any other version we've seen that can bounce 2 creatures. So that increases the amount of tempo you can get. And in addition to that, the fact that armies are such a big part of this format, army tokens, it matters. I mean, a lot of the time when you cast this thing, you end up bouncing an army and then one other thing. And in that case, you're not just generating tempo. I mean, you're still not getting like insane card value, because Usually, you know, a mass is just tacked onto cards your opponent was already playing, but you do change the board a lot in a single turn. You take away an army entirely. Sometimes it's pretty big, and then you bounce some other thing, and it really lets you attack more effectively. The ring tempts you being in the mix also allows you to more effectively set up a situation where your ring bearer just can't be blocked because you can bounce a couple of things, then choose a ring bearer, you know, your biggest ring bearer who can attack unblocked once you're done bouncing. And that, you know, you'll know that's going to get through. Like, it ends up being a pretty nice tempo play, and it gets closer to giving you a full card of value than I expected because of the whole army token situation. It's still not an insane card, don't get me wrong, but I said, like, basically you shouldn't play this, and that's not true. You know, having one of these is the right thing to do in a lot of your blue decks. Next, I have Bombadil's Song. So, you know, for a long time, I didn't like these sorts of combat tricks, you know, that grant hexproof or whatever. But I've come around on them a lot in recent sets. Like, we've seen a lot that are pretty good. You know, the fact that you can use them both to win combat and blank a removal spell has been pretty nice overall. But this is a card where it really hasn't delivered on doing the kind of thing that like cards like Tamiyo's Safekeeping and stuff have done. And the biggest problem is that it just doesn't really do enough in combat. So, you know, the thing that makes tricks really good these days, the best tricks, you know, they're either really cheap and offer a huge boost, or they're relatively flexible and relatively cheap. And what I mean by that is the kind of thing like Tamiyo's Safekeeping that only costs 1 mana and can be used to help your creature win combat a lot more often because it also grants, you know, it grants indestructibility and hexproof. It doesn't give you a stats boost, but you can manufacture a lot of situations when you know your creature is going to become indestructible that allow you to really win combat. This in combat is much more ineffective. +1/+1 just isn't enough. There are a lot of combats that it just doesn't help you win. And at that point, this is a trick that starts to turn into something that is mostly just like a counterspell for removal. And that's just not enough. It's not good enough. So it ends up not really working out. It isn't really a trick you want to be playing in green overall. Next up, I've got Chance Met Elves. This was a card, you know, going into the format, I thought looked pretty nice. You know, the scry deck kind of looked like it would be pretty good. And even, you know, last week, a week ago or so, I thought it was performing pretty well. But the more I've played with it, the more I've realized that the scry deck has some shortcomings. The less impressed I've been with this. It's not bad by any means, but I thought it was like one of green's better commons, and it's really not. So the main problem it has is one we've seen in a lot of, you see a lot in Limited. It costs 3 mana, and it starts out with too low of toughness, at only 2. There are multiple 1 mana spells in this format that can just kill this before you ever get a chance to scry, and that trade generates so much tempo for your opponent that it is absolutely brutal. So basically, it's too easy to kill before it really starts growing. And, you know, even once it's at 3 toughness, it's still vulnerable enough that it's not that impressive. Even if you buff it to 3 toughness on your next turn, you're often not going to have that good of attacks either if your opponent's been building out their board. So it's harder to get in with this than I expected and easier to kill it. And that has made it just merely like an okay common. And the fact that, you know, the scry deck overall hasn't performed very well really hurts its stock for obvious reasons too. I mean, you're not going to have a deck with a critical mass of scry because the motivations for doing so just aren't there. So this just ends up being a 3 mana 3/2 that will occasionally gain a counter or something, and that's not good enough. Next, I've got Saruman of Many Colors. So I gave this a bomb grade. The good news is I've seen basically, you know, all the people who do set reviews do, because I was kind of curious. I looked to see if I was the only one completely off base here. It's not bad. I mean, I'm not saying it's a bomb and it's unplayable, but I thought this was going to be one of the bigger bombs in the set. Mostly, well, not mostly, but a big part of it is the ward thing that it has is incredibly difficult. You 2-for-1 yourself at best. And that's still true. But what makes it worse than I expected is it's just not, you can't trigger its other ability often enough. You can't double spell, hit 2 things, you know, mill your opponent 2 things, and then also hope they have an instant sorcery or enchantment in their graveyard. Those aren't card types you see a lot of. So, you know, I've played with this a couple of times. I've played against it, and I've seen it trigger multiple times at this point where nothing happens. and that's a problem because, you know, it has inefficient stats. Sure, it has ward, but once it's not doing the other thing that it can do, I mean, your opponent can just send in big creatures. They don't even have to be big creatures. they can send in anything and hold up combat tricks and things like that and really put you in a horrible spot. So you just can't trigger it to make it happen in the first place by casting a second spell. You can't trigger that often enough, and you end up whiffing often enough too that it ends up instead being like, it's still a pretty good card, but it's also in, you know, 3 colors that don't have that good of fixing, which hurts its stock. But you kind of need the right deck, and you sort of need the right opponent. I mean, people just don't have enough instant sorceries and enchantments for you to always do something with the ability. Lastly, it's another rare. It's Horn of the Mark. I thought this looked like a pretty good rare. Never thought it was insane or anything, but, you know, I like the idea of a cheap artifact having a repeatable ability that can draw me cards, but it is something of a win more card. Like, if you're ahead by enough that you can consistently attack with 2 or more things, you're probably going to win anyway. So, I mean, it can help solidify your position, but it gets a lot worse when you're behind and you can't really afford to send in 2 creatures when 1 or both of them is going to die in combat. Another thing is, you know, this format a lot of the time devolves into ring bearers being the only thing that are swinging, and so you often only attack with 1 thing at a time anyway, so it's even harder to trigger. So getting cards out of this is harder than I expected, and it's not really a card I think you should run at all in the format. So I really came down on this from it being, you know, a reasonable quality rare that you'll play in most of your creature heavy decks to a card I don't really think you should be playing. So it's a pretty big change. All right, so that will do it for this edition of Nizzanotes. These were the 10 things I was wrong about in Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth Limited. If you enjoyed the video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on Lord of the Rings content for this, you know, this new limited format, there is a bunch of it on the channel, and you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.